Hello, U.S. government students. I am a day late. It is Monday evening when I'm filming this because, well, yesterday was Mother's Day and I was busy in the festivities. So, here we go. This could be our last actual video, but not our last class. I'll explain more in an email. Anyway, got two topics. Mother's Day and guess what? Yeah, you guessed it. COVID-19. So let's start with Mother's Day. It was Mother's Day yesterday, at least my time. By the time you do this, it may be a week later. Hope not. But I'm taking this from a post on Facebook from a historian who I follow. And her name is Heather Cox Richardson. And this is her post for May 9th. Day before Mother's Day. She was more timely than I am. Anyway, I'll ask you a few questions, and I'll ask them as they will appear. So I'll ask them, and then I'll go down to the section that answers them, and then I'll go on to the next question. So the first question is, what was the purpose of the first Mother's Day holiday, which was established in 1870? This is straight from her post. I edited it slightly, but the words are almost entirely hers. Google will tell you that Mother's Day began in 1908 when Anna Jarvis decided to honor her mother. But Mother's Day, with the apostrophe not in the singular spot, but in the plural, actually started in the 1870s, when the death toll from the Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War convinced American women that women must take control of politics from the men who had permitted such carnage. Mother's Day was not designed to encourage people to be nice to their mothers. It was part of women's effort to gain power to change modern society. Question number 2. What are some work experiences where women worked, beyond their traditional roles as child rearers and home keepers? That's a high calling, but they were called to go and do things in addition to those things. The Civil War years taught Americans what mass death meant in the modern era. The women who had watched their men march off to war were haunted by its results. They lost fathers, husbands, sons. The men who did come home were scarred in body and spirit. But out of the war also came a new sense of empowerment. Women had bought bonds, paid taxes, raised money for the war effort, harvested fields, worked in war industries, reared children, and nursed soldiers. And I'm going to add as well as many other things. When the war ended, they had every intention of continuing to participate in national affairs. Let's ask question number 3. How did Julia Ward Howe's marriage influence her views on women's rights? How did her marriage, Julia Ward Howe's marriage, influence her views on women's rights? But the 14th Amendment, which established that African American men were citizens, did not include women in 1869. Women organized the Women's Suffrage Association to promote women's rights to have a say in American government. From her home in Boston, Julia Ward Howe was a key figure in the suffrage movement. She was a very talented writer who had written the Battle Hymn of the Republic early in the Civil War, a hymn whose lyrics noted that Christ was, quote, born of woman, unquote. Howe was drawn to women's rights because the laws of her time meant that her children belonged to her abusive husband. If she broke free of him, she would lose any right to see her children, a fact that he threw at her whenever she threatened to leave him. She was not at first a radical in the mold of reformer Elizabeth Cady Stanton, believing that women had a human right to equality with men. Rather, she believed strongly that women as mothers, had a special role to perform in the world. Let's move on to number 5. Sorry, this is number 3. Sorry to confuse you there. How and why would women, as opposed to men, be better decision makers about war and about peace? This is according to Julia Ward Howe. How and why would women, as opposed to men, be better decision makers about war and about peace? Howe was drawn to women's rights because the laws of her time... I'm rereading the same paragraph. Howe had a new vision, she said, of the august dignity of motherhood and its terrible responsibilities. That's not the answer, by the way. She sat down immediately and wrote an appeal to womanhood throughout the world. Men always had and always would decide questions by resorting to mutual murder. But women did not have to accept this state of affairs, she wrote. Mothers could command their sons to stop the madness. It goes on. If you think you have it, it's not all of it. Arise, women, Howe commanded. Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We, women of one country, will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure others. All right, that's the full answer. All right. So, in the end, what specific right did Julia Ward Howe work toward so that women could take their place as equal participants in American society? It ends right after this. Howe believed that her women's peace movement would be the next great development in human history. You don't have it yet. Ending war just as the anti-slavery movement had ended human bondage. She called for a festival which would be observed as Mother's Day and which should be devoted to the advocacy of peace doctrines, to be held around the world on every year, a date that would permit open-air meetings. You don't have it yet. Howe organized international peace conferences, and American states developed their own Mother's Day festivals. But Howe quickly gave up on her project. She realized that there was much to be done before women could come together on such a momentous scale. She turned her attention to women's clubs to constitute a working and united womanhood. Don't have it yet. As she worked to unite women, she threw herself into the struggle for women's suffrage, understanding that in order to create a more just and peaceful society, women must take up their rightful place as equal participants in American society. Okay, you got it now. It's worth remembering the original Mother's Day and Julia Ward Howe's conviction that women must make their voices heard. Thank you, Julia Ward Howe, and thank you, Heather Cox Richardson, for bringing that to our attention. All right, our next question. We're halfway done. In fact, you're more than halfway done with the questions. COVID-19. This comes from an article by Aaron Brombridge. I think that's how you spell his name, who is in the Department of Biology and maybe Immunology at University of Massachusetts. And his article was inspired by a piece written by Jonathan Kay in, I think it's a publication called Quillette, and it's called COVID-19 Superspreader Events in 28 Countries, Critical Patterns and Lessons. Now, I quoted him in some places, but mostly edited it very heavily and summarized it. But it's entirely his thoughts. So here's your first of 2 questions from this article. According to the author, Aaron Brombridge, What will be the result of relaxing the state stay-at-home order? Here we go. It seems that many people are breathing some relief, and I'm not sure why. An epidemic curve has a predictable upslope, and once the peak is reached, the backslope can also be predicted. We have robust data from the outbreaks in China and Italy that show the backside of the mortality curve declines slowly, and deaths persisting for months. Assuming we have just crested in deaths at 70,000 people in this country alone, it is possible that we lose another 70,000 over the next 6 weeks. That's the model with a lockdown. There are very few states that have demonstrated a sustained decline in numbers of new infections. The majority of states are still increasing and yet reopening. If you take out New York, the state of New York, daily case numbers are increasing in the United States. So throughout most of the country, we're going to add fuel to the viral fire by reopening. It's just going to happen. Number 7. Name 5 pieces of advice from this article that could help you stay safe as we move out of quarantine and more into our public communities. I realize we haven't been completely quarantined at home, but we will see a shift, a very discernible shift in moving our lives a little bit more to ordinary. So anyway, I'll ask that one more time. Name 5 pieces of advice from this article, and it may be something you already know, but there are some good specific ones here that could help you, that could help all of us stay safe as we move out of the quarantine. And it could actually be a piece of advice that doesn't tell you to do something to be more protective. It could say something that you maybe don't have to worry about quite as much. Anyway, any 5 things. So, with that evidence, the writer's saying, okay, so we're going to open up and we're going to be more susceptible to COVID-19 than we ever have been. So here's what we know. So you personally, and as a family and whoever you interact with, can be as safe as possible as we move into a more public sphere. We know that most people get infected by someone in a family or a quarantine group bringing it home. But where are people catching the infection out in the community? I need to let you know that we don't have definitive data from this virus, but it's based on other viruses. Infection happens when you are exposed to the virus in a big enough dose of the virus. A moment of being sneezed or coughed on can infect, which is why it's so important for symptomatic people to stay at home, quarantined. Coughs and sneezes travel so fast and far that a person can infect a room full of people. However, it might take minutes of talking with a person at, let's say, 2 or 3 feet distance to get enough exposure to be infected. You can touch infected surfaces and your hands can carry it around, but you won't contract it until that hand touches your mouth or it rubs your eye or enough of it gets on the food that you eat. Those are some things that were in the article, but I also sort of summarized a lot. He says at least 44% of all infections and the majority of community-required transmissions, that is more than 50% of the ones that you get outside of the home rather than ones transmitted by people in your family or quarantine group, occur from people without any symptoms. That is, it's asymptomatic people who are spreading it more than people with symptoms. So, what are the things to avoid? Any environment that is enclosed with poor air circulation and a high density of people spells trouble. Large work centers, crowded shopping areas, large events like weddings, funerals, church services, busy restaurants, face-to-face business meetings, and we've probably seen in the news where they've followed cases of weddings or all the meatpacking plants that have recently come about as well as funerals and church services. For example, a church choir in Washington State. Listen to this. Even though people were aware of the virus and took steps to minimize transfer, this is during a choir rehearsal. That is, they avoided the usual handshakes and hugs. People also brought their own sheet music to avoid sharing, and they socially distanced themselves during practice. A single asymptomatic carrier infected most of the people in attendance. The choir sang for 2.5 hours inside an enclosed church, which was roughly the size of a volleyball court. Kind of a small area for 60 people. Singing to a greater degree than talking aerosolizes respiratory droplets extraordinarily well. Deep breathing while singing facilitated those respiratory drops getting into the lungs. Both it facilitated them getting out, and it facilitated them because people were inhaling with greater gusto. Deep breathing while singing, okay, got that. 2.5 hours of exposure ensured that people were exposed to enough virus over a long enough period of time for infection to take place. Over a period of 4 days, 45 of the 60 choir members developed symptoms. 2 died. The youngest infected was 31, but they averaged 67 years old. So what do these cases have in common? He lists many others in the article, but I thought that was the most dramatic and shortest. Well, as we said, indoor spaces with limited air exchange or recycled air and lots of people are concerning from a transmission standpoint. We know that 60 people in a volleyball court-sized room results in massive infections. The same situation with a restaurant and the call center, other situations where there were massive spreading. Social distancing guidelines don't protect in indoor spaces where you spend a lot of time, as people on the opposite side of the room were infected. The principle is viral exposure over an extended period of time. In these cases, people were exposed to the virus in the air for a prolonged period, that is hours. Even if they were 50 feet away, even a low dose of the virus in the air reaching them over a sustained period was enough to cause infection and in some cases death. Social distancing is important, but they're really to protect you with more brief exposure or outdoor exposure. When assessing the risk of infection via respiration at the grocery store or mall, you need to consider the volume of the airspace, very large, the number of people, hopefully restricted, how long people are spending in the store, that is, workers all day, customers an hour. Taken together, for a person shopping, the low density, the high air volume of the store, along with the restricted time you spend in the store, means that the opportunity to receive an infectious dose is quite low. But for the store worker, the extended time they spend in the store provides a greater opportunity to receive the infectious dose, and therefore their jobs become more risky. I had never even thought about this. Basically, as the work closures are loosened and we start to venture out more, possibly even resuming in-office activities, you need to look at your environment and make judgments. How many people are here? How much airflow is there around me? And how long will I be in this environment? If you are in an open floor plan office, you really need to critically assess the risk. Volume, people, airflow. If you are in a job that requires face-to-face talking, or even worse, yelling, you need to assess the risk. In fact, at other places, he says that the meatpacking plant was terrible because they couldn't wear masks, and they were yelling over the loud volume of the meatpacking plants in order to be heard. So, and cold temperatures, all those being ripe for exchanging the disease, exchanging the virus. If you're sitting in a well-ventilated space with few people, the risk is actually quite low. If I'm outside and walk past someone, remember it's a dose and time needed for infection. You would have to be in the airstream for 5+ minutes for a chance of infection. While joggers may be releasing more virus due to deep breathing, remember their exposure time is also less due to their speed in passing you. While I focus on respiratory exposure here, please don't forget surfaces. Those infected respiratory droplets land somewhere. Wash your hands often and stop touching your face. As we are allowed to move around our communities more freely and be in contact with more people in more places more regularly, the risks to ourselves and our families are significant. Even if you are gung-ho for opening and resuming business as usual, and that's what my wife and Mrs. Newtbar and I are talking about with our business. Do your part and wear a mask to reduce what you release into the environment. It will help everyone, including your own business. All right, that was from inspired by a piece written by Jonathan Kay, and the actual author of it was Aaron Bromage from UMass. All right, the other thing I want to say, he mentions it a little bit, is wearing masks is really important. I don't know if I talked about this in another week, but Mrs. Newbar showed me a great diagram that shows the two people in different mask wearing situations. In one situation, neither person is wearing a mask. In that situation, the chance is very high that if one of them is infected, it will reach the other person, especially if there is a long period of time, as we learned about here, and they're close, okay? And if they're in an enclosed room. But this particular, let's call it a diagram, didn't talk about some of the things that this article talked about. The second one is, let's say the person who is infected has no mask, and the other person has a mask. Then the transmission rate is still pretty high. It's much less than if neither is wearing a mask, but it's still fairly high. I think it was like 50%, or maybe even 70% or something like that. But if both people are wearing masks, the chance of infection drops dramatically. So everyone should be wearing masks. You can change your behavior if you're not wearing a mask, or if people you know aren't wearing a mask. And feel free to give dirty looks to people who are not wearing masks, as well as give them a very wide berth to know that you think that they're temporarily being terrible human beings. Not terrible human beings, but I think they're being too glib about the situation. Okay, that's it. And I will tell you in an email how we're going to finish up next week. Take care, guys. Bye.